My high school had this building that was closed down. We called it the old building, even though it really wasn't any older than any of the other buildings on campus. For some strange reason though, it was always closed down. The doors were all boarded up, and the students were forbidden to try and get into that building at all. The story that was passed down along all the students was that there was an old janitor named Mabel. He was a guy who worked in the old building. He was working late in the building one night when an escaped lunatic broke into the school. The lunatic supposedly killed Mabel by drowning him in the toilet. Afterwards, he took a hacksaw and hacked Mabel up into tiny pieces, then flushed him down the drain. Afterwards, they closed the building down because they didn't think it was right having children be taught in the same building in which such a brutal murder had taken place. Of course, as you might know, with urban legends, it doesn't just stop there. You know how kids are, not exactly original. There was this idea that if you went into one of the bathrooms in the old building and made sure all the stall doors were closed, then said Bloody Mabel 5 times in the mirror, Mabel would climb out of the toilet and murder you, then drag you down the drain. Of course, we knew the story was not true, but guys would often dare each other to go into the old building and do this little ritual. Of course, the day came along that I was dared as well by some old rivals of mine to break into that old building and try the ritual out. Unbeknownst to the faculty, the students had long discovered a way of getting into the old building through a busted window. Pretending to be brave but actually being quite nervous, I climbed in through that broken window. The old building seemed a lot like any other abandoned building you'd see around. It was quite unkempt in there. There was tons of graffiti all over the walls. Now, the lore was that you were supposed to find the boys' bathroom on the east end of the bottom floor. It wasn't very difficult to find, actually. There was a ton of Bloody Mabel graffiti on the wall. Well, as much as I could see with my small flashlight. I guess I should have mentioned it was dark out. I wasn't allowed to use a light when doing the ritual, though. I'm not particularly sure how anyone would know if I ever did, but I decided to play by the rules anyway. The middle stall door was already closed. I went over to the sink that was facing the stall, and then with a bit of a nervous chuckle, I began to say the incantation, Bloody Mabel, Bloody Mabel, Bloody Mabel, Bloody Mabel. As anyone would, I made sure to pause for a moment before saying it for the final time. With a deep breath, I said the final Bloody Mabel. I stood there for half a second, expecting something really to happen. Of course, nothing did. The bit of nervousness I'd felt in the beginning went away almost instantly. I actually felt really relaxed now. As I turned and walked back into the hallway though, I found myself face to face with the nastiest looking man I'd ever seen. Standing there in dirty clothes, staring daggers at me right in the eyes. In shock, I fell back onto the floor. The man looked like some sort of vagrant, really dirty and unshaven. He didn't seem to have a weapon on him at all, but the sheer look on his face told me he was not pleased at seeing me there. Likely he was just a homeless man living in the old building, wanting to stay undetected. Now I had discovered his hiding place, and that was not good for him. I tried to get up, but when I moved, he loomed over me. I was scared. I had no idea what the man was going to do. He grabbed me and pulled me up. He shoved me against the wall hard. I remember it was so hard it knocked the wind out of me. I did the only thing I could think to do. It was automatic. I didn't even have time to think about it. I used every ounce of strength I had and kneed him right in the crotch. He buckled over, but surprisingly, he still didn't let go of me. I continued to knee him 2 more times. The man doubled over in pain, and I hightailed it out of the old building. My friends all noticed how disheveled I looked, and I told them someone really was in there. At first, they all thought I was just trying to scare them by claiming it was Bloody Mabel, but I explained what had really happened. One of my friends went and called the police, but when the police searched the old building, they didn't find anyone else there. Me and my friends were by the busted window the whole time. And we know the guy didn't come out that way, so either he had found a different way to move in and out, or he had a really good hiding place. I mean, it must have been one of those, because I know there's no such thing as any bloody Mabel. I went to boarding school as a child. My family is pretty well off, and they've always tried to make it seem like sending me to a boarding school was the best thing for my education. Honestly though, I thought it was the best thing for them to avoid parenting as much as possible. If I sound bitter, I'm really not for the most part. Actually, I really enjoyed boarding school. However, there was one year when I was 12 that I did not have a positive experience at all. You see, there was this guy in my grade who was a bit of a bully. You know, the type that goes to a really good school and almost makes you wonder how he even managed to get himself in this place. Now, if that part makes me sound bitter, that's because I certainly was. The kid's name was Scott, and he made my life a living hell for a short period of time. Whenever he saw me, he would push me, poke me, prod me, punch me, call me every name in the book. I really couldn't understand why he'd singled me out so much for this sort of torment, because I was definitely not the nerdish or bookish type. I guess there was just something about me he didn't like very much. Our interactions probably wouldn't have gone past normal bullying if it hadn't been for one certain incident in particular. I was walking on the grounds between classes. It had been raining, so the ground was really wet and mushy. I wasn't in that much of a hurry to get to class, but I was somewhat absent-minded, so when I suddenly tripped over something and fell face first into a large puddle of mud, I was completely covered in wet sludge. I turned over and saw Scott there. He was laughing his ass off, as if he had just seen the funniest thing in his whole life. I knew I couldn't go to class this messy. I knew I had to go back to my dorm room to change all my clothes, which of course meant I would be late for my next class and would likely get demerits for it. Pissed beyond belief, I grabbed a handful of mud and shoved it right in Scott's face. Getting up, I kicked him even harder in the crotch. He crumpled to the ground, cursing at me, threatening the hell out of me too. The problem was for him, in his current condition, he wasn't going to be able to do much. After that event, I didn't even mind the fact that I was late for class. Instead, I felt really good for finally standing up for myself. I guess it was quite short-sighted in hindsight though. I honestly thought that all my problems with Scott would be ended that night. I returned to my dorm and the lights were all out. I saw my roommate was lying in bed, so I decided not to disturb him. I came in, undressed, and decided to get some rest myself. I climbed into bed and dozed off for a while. Later into the night though, something awoke me very suddenly. I wasn't sure what it was at first, but it was definitely something. I looked around the room and saw my roommate was sitting up in his bed looking over at me also. I asked him if something was wrong, but he didn't respond to me. He just sat there looking at me. After a moment, he waved me off and laid back down on the bed. I certainly thought that was very weird, but I didn't think too much of it. I dozed back off. The next time I awoke, it's because I felt someone nudging me. I opened my eyes, only to see Scott standing over me. My eyes shot over to my roommate's bed, only to see it was empty. I was going to yell or scream, but Scott put his hand over my mouth and pressed really hard against it. Then he pulled out a pocket knife. Scared, I tried screaming again. I tried to bite his hand even. I tried anything to get him off me, but to no avail. Scott flipped open the blade. Then he took the knife and slowly traced it down, stopping on my boxer shorts. "You kicked me in the balls, you know. It seems only fair I get you back." I screamed in his hand some more and tried with all my might to push him off. Fortunately though, he moved the knife away from my boxers. He brought it up to my face though and cut a little line down my cheek. I immediately felt the blood spilling out and I began to cry. "Next time it will be your balls," he said. Then he punched me in the face and warned me that if I told anyone, he would kill me and my roommate. Well, of course I told. I mean, anyone who didn't tell who had threatened them with a knife needs to have their head examined. He was picked up soon after by the campus police and got turned over to the actual police soon after. He was expelled from the school and I never saw him again. Thank God for that. I definitely dreamt of that night over and over again for years after though, and it left me with quite a scar. I remember when I was in the 2nd or 3rd grade, my school had a teacher's strike. It was a long one too. School was canceled every day for at least 2 weeks. When it appeared the strike was not going to end anytime soon, the school board brought in substitute teachers to teach all the classes. A lot of students were pretty pissed off that their extended summer break had finally ended. I, however, was ecstatic that I was finally getting back to class. Yeah, so I was a bit of a nerd, what of it? Well, of course, the teachers striking were pretty pissed off about the substitutes. A few of them were so immature about it, they even heckled some of the students as they were going to class. One of the teachers, we'll just call her Mrs. Lulak, took some pretty nasty things to me as I was walking by their picket line. She had sort of a reputation for being a bit of a bitch, so I did my best to just ignore her. It was really an odd way to behave towards a 3rd grader. One of the days that I was in class, another incident happened as well. Mrs. Lulak got way too close to the building I was supposed to have been in. Her classroom had the teachers not been on strike. While our substitute was out of the room, she came right up to the open window, stuck her arm in, and acted like she was trying to grab around for something. It really scared the crap out of all of us. She fled before the substitute came back as well. All in all, a strike was one thing, but this woman just came across as mentally unbalanced to me, and this is from the perspective of a 3rd grader, extremely mentally unbalanced. Of course, there was a boundary the striking teachers were not supposed to cross, but she had no respect for not crossing it. The strike went on for the 3rd week with more of these strange incidents occurring. I told my mom about how she was behaving, and she claimed she would call the school about it. I'm not sure she ever did though, maybe she just forgot. When I went to school on Monday morning, I noticed Miss Lulak was not in the picket line anymore. I felt a bit better about that. I even suspected that if the strike ended, she still wouldn't come back to become my teacher because of her actions during it. During the 3rd class of that day, I really had to go to the bathroom, like really badly. I couldn't wait for the normal bathroom break, so I raised my hand to see if I could go. I got permission and walked into the bathroom to one of the urinals. As I was walking to the sink though, a stall door suddenly opened behind me and someone grabbed me from behind. They pulled me into the stall, closing the door behind us. I was startled to turn around and see that it was Miss Lulak in the boys' bathroom. She grabbed me and started to shake me back and forth. She kept on blabbering about wanting her fucking classroom back. She shook me so hard I hit my head on the wall of the stall several times. I'm sure it was then I started crying. I was completely terrified. She shoved me back against the wall and I fell to the floor bawling. The stall door opened just then, and the custodian that was there saw what was happening. He instructed her to step back from me immediately, then put his hand out gently towards me. I grabbed it, and he pulled me to my feet and put me behind him. He let me out of the bathroom and took me to the nurse's office as well, before going to speak with the principal immediately. My parents came to the school to pick me up. My father was of course furious. He demanded that she be arrested and fired. I don't really know exactly what happened to her after that, but I do know she did not become my teacher that year, and I never saw her again after. When I was in elementary school, there was this really nice janitor that I really liked. Most of the other kids made fun of him actually, but I was never sure why they did. They told stories about him and claimed that he was mentally ill or he had escaped from the crazy house or something. I think it was because he seemed a little bit off to them. He was quiet and never responded when any of the other students were talking to him. Sometimes he would just stare at people quite blankly as well. I was the type of kid, however, who hated to see people sad. I hated to see people getting picked on for no reason. So one day, when I saw just how sad this was making the janitor, I decided to do something nice for him to cheer him up. I went out during recess and picked a couple of daisies. I brought them into the school and gave them to him. He took them, and I actually saw the man smile for the very first time. I also heard him speak for the very first time when he said thank you to me. After that, for a couple of weeks, the janitor seemed a lot different than before. He smiled whenever he saw me, and he would always say, "Hi, Jenny." I would always say hi right back to him. Some of the other kids made fun of me for talking to him and joked that the janitor must have a crush on me. I just ignored them. People saying mean things never really bothered me at all. A few weeks after, I had the first talk with the janitor personally. I brought him more flowers from the schoolyard. This time, when I handed them to him and he thanked me, he said something else. "Hey, do you want to see where I keep all the daisies you bring me?" As he asked me this, I of course nodded and told him yes. I was pretty interested. He then told me to follow him. He led me down to the janitor's closet, which was a bit down the hall. He opened the door and turned on the light. I had given him quite a lot of flowers over the past 5 or 6 weeks. It seemed like every single one of them was in there. Somehow, he also had my school picture as well. Who knows how he got it in the first place? It was hanging up on the wall by the vase that was overstuffed with dying flowers. For the first time, I was actually a bit concerned about this guy. Before I could even say anything to him, though, the janitor grabbed me and pushed me back into the room. I fell down on my knees. He flicked the light off and for some reason closed the door behind him. I heard it lock from the outside, and I began to panic like any 10-year-old girl would in such a situation. I began screaming and crying at the top of my lungs. I ran over to the door and began pounding on it with my tiny fists and kicking it with my feet. Tears began to flow down my face. The only fortunate thing about the situation was that I was too young to have any idea what he really wanted from me in that moment. It was likely that I was only in that closed closet for a few minutes, but it seemed like an eternity. Eventually, I heard the key in the door, and the door was opened. Outside was the school principal and the gym teacher. Apparently, a few kids had seen him shove me into the closet and ran to get the principal right away. The principal took me by the hand and told me that he would take me to the nurse's office to call my parents. The gym teacher had the janitor by the collar and was told to take him to the principal's office and call the police right away. I was okay in the end. My mom and dad were so pissed though. They demanded the man be fired right away and put in jail. Obviously, he was fired, and I never saw him again after. I have no idea if he went to jail though. To this day, my parents won't tell me anything else about the incident, likely to protect me. This took place in February of 1988, when I was just 8 years old. I'm now approaching my mid-40s. I still have massive anxiety whenever I think back to that night. For context, I'm a man, and have always been the shortest person in my class, with the smallest body frame. I was living with my mom, my stepdad, and my older sister who was 3 years my senior. Because my parents were extremely poor, we found ourselves moving around quite a bit. At the time this story took place, we were renting out a rundown duplex in Utah. I'm fairly confident this took place on a Wednesday evening, as that was the weekday my family would gather around the television and watch America's Most Wanted. After the TV show had ended around 9 p.m., we said goodnight and headed off to our own bedrooms. It was a school night, so I often went to bed around 9 or so. Our duplex had 3 bedrooms, 2 on the main floor and 1 in the basement. My room was on the main floor, just down the hall from the living room, while my mom and stepdad's bedroom was adjacent to mine at the end of the hallway. My older sister had the lone room in the basement. At that age, I was fearful of the dark, so I often slept with my bedroom light on to allow perfect vision. Because my parents never paid their bills anyway, they never had an issue with this, as most other parents might. We had a false sense of security living in this small Utah town, so my parents never locked our front door. My mom and her husband always had a lock on their bedroom door though, and made sure to lock it every night so we kids couldn't come in unexpectedly. I remember drifting off to sleep shortly after laying down. It must have been around 1 a.m. or so, when I was abruptly awoken by a peculiar noise coming from my room. As I sat up in my bed in response to the noise, I was horrified to see 2 grown men sporting biker beards and easily towering 6 feet tall, standing in my bedroom doorway. Again, I was able to see every detail of these slovenly men because my light had been left on. The men standing in the doorway were blocking me in my room so I could not move past them. They both had the most evil glare in their eyes that I had ever seen too. I was petrified with fear. I don't know why I did this, but in that moment of complete shock, I jumped up from my bed and onto my feet. Only then did it dawn on me that my tiny body was not going to be able to do anything to these guys. My parents' room was directly against their backs. My first instinct was to run to them and call out. Looking back now though, I realize it would have done no good because of how securely they slept, comfortably behind their locked bedroom door while this was taking place. Once my body's motions caught up to my thought process, I instead ran to the corner of my room and crouched down. All the while, the 3 of us were just staring at each other. I tried to let out a scream or call for my parents, but this was the only time in my life where I couldn't even make a noise. My vain attempts to scream mounted into silent desperation. I didn't know what these people wanted, and I could only imagine the worst. One of the men pushed his index finger to his lips to signal me to remain quiet. As I trembled with fear, the second man reached into his pocket and pulled out a 6-inch blade. My room was fairly small, and they were both now standing within 4 feet of me. He made sure to swivel the knife in the air to make the point he was not afraid to gut me like a fish. I swear I pissed in my pajamas. Another attempt to scream yielded nothing yet again. Shortly after, they closed my bedroom door, and I was left all alone. Instinctively, I thought they must be robbing our house, but now that they were exposed and had threatened me, they would now leave. But boy, was I wrong. I waited a few minutes, not knowing what to do. Do I open the door and try to pound on my parents' door? Were the guys still waiting for me there behind the now closed door? Who knew? After a few minutes, I gathered what little courage I could and decided to crawl back in my bed and place the sheet over my entire body and wait it out. Were they planning on killing my family? I asked myself. Did they leave yet? What did they want? My anxiety grew as thoughts continued to race through my mind. As I lay there intently listening for any sounds, I could hear them moving around the house and opening and closing various drawers. The walls were paper thin in that cheap duplex, so every move was easily heard. Next, I heard them make their way down the stairs to the basement where my sister was sleeping alone. I was listening to every frightening sound, with all hope in my heart that my stepdad would wake up. He was a fairly large and intimidating man, and these creeps weren't exactly being super quiet. This went on for nearly an hour. I was lying petrified in bed listening to every move. To my horror, my entire family seemed to be sleeping through the ordeal. After some time, I heard the front door shut once again, and the early winter sun began rising. My stepdad worked in a factory and usually woke up around 5 a.m. I couldn't wait to hear my parents unlock their bedroom door. As soon as I heard their alarm, I ran out of my room. I was hysterical, trying to explain what had happened. Next, my sister woke up. I desperately wanted to tell her what happened by herself in the basement. My parents tried their best to calm me down. Tears were streaming down my face, and I had been traumatized. To my disbelief, though, my parents chalked it up to being only a bad dream. In fact, I was told this was not even possible, because if anything like that ever happened, surely they would wake up. My sister saw the desperation in my eyes and knew this must be serious. She and I went through the entire house to look for items that might have been stolen. We came across her dresser drawers left half open and many personal items out of place. This was enough evidence for her to become just as frightened as I was. Because nothing was missing from our house though, my parents didn't even bother calling the police. I was made to go to school as if nothing had ever happened. Fast forward a couple of weeks though, we were all watching TV together and an update came on about a criminal being captured, featured on Most Wanted. My heart immediately sank when I recognized the mugshot on TV as being one of the men who was in my room that night. Of course, disclosing this to my parents only made them believe me even less. To this day, I still hold some resentment towards them. While they slept peacefully behind a locked bedroom door, I was busy being victimized. Needless to say, I never sleep without locking my door from then on.